Picture this: a decorated war hero stands before the highest court in the land, his chest bare where a medal of honor once gleamed. The judge's gavel has fallen, the verdict delivered with ice-cold authority: the medal must be removed, the honor stripped away. But what the judge didn't know, what no one in that courtroom could have imagined, was that this decision would uncover a truth so shocking, so deeply buried in military secrets, that it would change everything they thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and the real meaning of heroism. This is the story of Captain Marcus Thompson, a man whose greatest act of valor was deemed a lie by those who never walked in his boots, and the Royal Guard who risked everything to reveal a truth that had been hidden for decades. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign soil, they're fought in courtrooms, in the corridors of power, and in the hearts of those who refuse to let injustice have the final word. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the federal courthouse as Captain Marcus Thompson adjusted his military dress uniform for what he believed would be the last time. The Medal of Honor gleamed against his chest, its blue ribbon a stark contrast to the weight of uncertainty that had settled in his heart over the past 6 months. At 52, Marcus had seen more battlefields than most men see birthdays, but nothing had prepared him for this particular war, one fought with lawyers instead of rifles, where the enemy wore suits instead of uniforms. The accusations had started as whispers in the Pentagon corridors. Someone had questioned the official report from Operation Desert Shield, specifically the incident that had earned Marcus his medal 28 years ago. Anonymous sources claimed the heroic rescue of 12 soldiers from a burning convoy had been fabricated, that Marcus had actually abandoned his post and left his men to die. The investigation that followed was swift and merciless, conducted by officials who had never heard a shot fired in anger, yet felt qualified to judge the actions of men who had. Marcus remembered the day the letter arrived at his small suburban home in Virginia. His wife, Sarah, had been tending to her rose garden when the mail carrier brought the certified delivery. The official seal of the Department of Defense seemed to burn through the envelope as Marcus read the words that would change his life forever. An investigation into his military record had been initiated based on new evidence that called into question the authenticity of his Medal of Honor citation. He was ordered to appear before a military tribunal to defend his actions and the honor he had carried for nearly 3 decades. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of legal meetings, document reviews, and sleepless nights. Marcus found himself reliving that day in the Iraqi desert over and over again, trying to understand how a moment of pure instinct and courage could be twisted into something so ugly. He could still smell the burning fuel, still hear the screams of his men trapped in the overturned vehicles. The enemy fire had been relentless, coming from 3 directions as their convoy was ambushed in a narrow valley. Most commanders would have called for backup and waited for air support, but Marcus knew his soldiers didn't have that kind of time. Sarah watched her husband grow thinner and more distant with each passing day. The man who had faced down enemy forces without flinching now seemed to shrink under the weight of bureaucratic warfare. She found him most nights sitting in his study, staring at old photographs from his military service, as if searching for some proof that the life he had lived was real. The Medal of Honor sat in its display case on his desk, no longer a symbol of pride but a reminder of how quickly honor could become shame in the eyes of those who had never earned it. The investigation team was led by Colonel Patricia Stevens, a career military lawyer known for her ruthless efficiency and complete lack of sentiment. She approached Marcus's case like a surgeon approaches a tumor, something to be cut out cleanly and without emotion. Stevens had built her reputation on exposing fraudulent military honors, and she saw Marcus Thompson as just another case file to be closed. Her preliminary findings suggested that Marcus had been nowhere near the convoy when it was attacked, that he had been safely positioned 2 miles away and only arrived after the shooting had stopped. What Stevens didn't know was that the official records from Operation Desert Shield had been altered years ago as part of a classified cover-up that reached the highest levels of military command. The real story of what happened that day in the desert was buried so deep in classified files that even she couldn't access them without clearance she didn't possess. The Marcus Thompson she was investigating was a ghost, a carefully constructed fiction designed to hide a truth that could embarrass powerful people and expose military operations that officially never happened. Marcus's military lawyer, Major David Harrison, was young and eager but hopelessly outmatched by the machine that had been set in motion against his client. Harrison had graduated at the top of his class from the military academy but had never handled a case with such high stakes and political implications. He found himself fighting not just for Marcus's reputation, but against a system that seemed determined to erase a man's entire legacy based on evidence that felt manufactured and convenient. The first hearing took place on a gray October morning in a windowless conference room deep within the Pentagon. Marcus sat ramrod straight in his chair as Colonel Stevens presented her case with clinical precision. She displayed satellite photos, radio transcripts, and witness statements that painted a picture of cowardice and deception. According to her evidence, Marcus had falsified his after-action report and coerced his men into corroborating a story that never happened. The Medal of Honor, she argued, was based on a lie and should be stripped away immediately. Harrison's defense felt weak even as he presented it. Without access to classified materials or the ability to call certain witnesses, he was fighting with one hand tied behind his back. He knew Marcus was telling the truth. It was evident in every word the man spoke, every gesture he made when recounting that day in the desert. But knowing something and proving it in a military tribunal were two entirely different things, especially when the deck was stacked against you from the beginning. The other members of Marcus's unit who might have testified on his behalf were either dead, unreachable, or bound by classification levels that made their testimony impossible to obtain. The few who did speak on his behalf told stories that seemed to contradict the official record, creating more questions than answers. It became clear that someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that the truth of Operation Desert Shield remained buried, but nobody could explain why or what they were trying to hide. As the hearings progressed, Marcus began to notice strange inconsistencies in the evidence against him. Radio logs that should have existed were missing. Photographs that should have shown his position were either corrupted or had timestamps that didn't match other documents. It was as if someone had carefully erased pieces of history while leaving just enough behind to create a convincing fiction. The question wasn't whether someone was lying, it was who was lying and what they were trying to protect. Sarah attended every hearing, sitting in the back row with the quiet dignity of a military wife who had weathered countless storms. She watched her husband's reputation being dismantled piece by piece, knowing that the man she had married was incapable of the cowardice he was being accused of. Marcus had saved lives throughout his career, not just in that one incident in Iraq, but in dozens of smaller moments that never made it into official reports. She had seen him wake up screaming from nightmares about the men he couldn't save, not the lies he had supposedly told. The media coverage was relentless and mostly one-sided. Military reporters who should have known better jumped on the story of a fallen war hero with the enthusiasm of sharks sensing blood in the water. Headlines screamed about fraud in the military and questioned how many other Medal of Honor recipients might be living lies. Marcus found himself portrayed as the symbol of everything wrong with military culture, a man who had stolen honor from those who had truly earned it. Colonel Stevens seemed to take personal satisfaction in each piece of damaging evidence she presented. For her, this case wasn't about justice, it was about proving that she was tougher and more thorough than anyone else in military law enforcement. She had already decided that Marcus was guilty before the hearings began, and every day of testimony only reinforced her predetermined conclusion. The idea that she might be wrong, that she might be destroying an innocent man's life, never seemed to occur to her. The preliminary hearings lasted 3 weeks, during which Marcus aged what felt like years. The weight of uncertainty, combined with the daily assault on his character, took a toll that was visible to everyone who knew him. His shoulders, which had always been squared with military bearing, began to slump. His voice, which had commanded respect on countless battlefields, grew quiet and uncertain. The man who had faced enemy fire without flinching was being broken by the cold machinery of bureaucratic warfare. Major Harrison worked frantically behind the scenes, trying to find anyone who could shed light on the classified aspects of Operation Desert Shield. He made calls to retired generals, former intelligence officers, and anyone else who might have been involved in desert operations during that time period. Most of his calls went unanswered, and those who did respond spoke in careful, measured words that revealed nothing while suggesting everything. It became clear that Operation Desert Shield was connected to something much larger and more sensitive than anyone was willing to admit. The final blow came when Colonel Stevens announced that she had obtained sworn testimony from Sergeant William Foster, who had supposedly been present during the convoy attack. Foster claimed that Marcus had been nowhere near the fighting and had only appeared after other units had rescued the trapped soldiers. His testimony was devastating and, seemingly credible, delivered via video link from his home in Montana where he worked as a mechanic and tried to forget his years in the military. What nobody knew was that Foster was lying, not out of malice but out of fear. He had been contacted weeks earlier by men who identified themselves as former military intelligence officers. They had shown him classified documents that they claimed proved Marcus was involved in activities that could embarrass the government if they became public. Foster was told that his cooperation in discrediting Marcus would be seen as a patriotic duty, while his refusal might result in his own military record being scrutinized more closely. Foster had secrets of his own from his time in Iraq, and the implied threat was enough to secure his cooperation. The preliminary hearings concluded with a recommendation that Marcus Thompson face a full court-martial for fraud, conduct unbecoming an officer, and theft of military honors. The Medal of Honor would be temporarily suspended pending the outcome of the trial, and Marcus would be confined to base while awaiting his fate. As he left the hearing room for the last time, Marcus felt the weight of the medal against his chest and wondered if he would ever wear it again. The man who had dedicated his life to serving his country was now being destroyed by the very institution he had sworn to protect. The drive home that evening was conducted in complete silence. Sarah had stopped trying to find words of comfort, and Marcus had stopped believing that justice would prevail. They both knew that the real battle was just beginning, but neither of them could have imagined that the key to Marcus's salvation was already walking the halls of Buckingham Palace, wearing the crimson tunic of the Queen's Guard and carrying secrets that could change everything. The truth about Operation Desert Shield was about to be revealed by the last person anyone would expect, in a way that no one could have predicted. That night, Marcus sat in his study for the last time as a free man, staring at the Medal of Honor and remembering the faces of the 12 soldiers he had pulled from those burning vehicles. Whatever happened next, whatever lies were told about him, he knew in his heart that those men had gone home to their families because of what he had done that day in the desert. That knowledge would have to be enough to sustain him through the darkness that lay ahead. The court-martial convened on a bitter January morning at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in a courtroom that had seen hundreds of military trials but rarely one with such national attention. Captain Marcus Thompson entered the room wearing his dress uniform without the Medal of Honor for the first time in 28 years. The empty space on his chest where the medal should have been seemed to draw every eye in the courtroom, a visible reminder of what was at stake. The media gallery was packed with reporters from major news networks, military journalists, and veteran advocacy groups, all waiting to witness the downfall or vindication of a once-celebrated war hero. Judge Colonel Margaret Thornfield presided over the proceedings with the stern efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years in military law. Known for her fair but uncompromising approach to justice, Thornfield had handled some of the most high-profile military cases of the past decade. She was neither impressed by heroic reputations nor swayed by emotional appeals. To her, the law was the law, and evidence was evidence, regardless of the rank or reputation of the accused. Her sultan pepper hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her steel-gray eyes missed nothing as they surveyed the courtroom. The prosecution team was led by Colonel Patricia Stevens, who had spent months preparing what she believed was an airtight case. Alongside her sat Captain Jennifer Walsh, a brilliant legal mind who specialized in military fraud cases, and Major Thomas Burke, an investigator who had uncovered what they claimed was compelling evidence of Marcus's deception. Stevens approached the case with the confidence of someone who had never lost a major prosecution, and she intended to maintain that record by thoroughly destroying Marcus Thompson's credibility. Defense attorney Major David Harrison looked young and overwhelmed as he sat beside Marcus at the defendant's table. Despite his inexperience with cases of this magnitude, Harrison had spent the past 3 months working 18-hour days, determined not to let his client down. He had assembled a small team of military lawyers and private investigators, but their resources were limited compared to the prosecution's virtually unlimited budget and access to classified materials. Harrison knew he was fighting an uphill battle, but he also knew that Marcus Thompson was innocent of the charges against him. The gallery behind the defense table was filled with Marcus's family and supporters. Sarah sat in the front row, her face composed but her hands betraying her nervousness as they twisted a tissue in her lap. Their daughter, Lisa, had flown in from California where she worked as a nurse, taking time off to support her father through the most difficult period of his life. Behind them sat a handful of veterans who had served with Marcus over the years, men and women who refused to believe the accusations against their former commander. Colonel Stevens rose to deliver her opening statement with the confidence of a prosecutor who believed she held all the winning cards. She painted a picture of systematic deception that spanned nearly 3 decades, describing Marcus as a man who had built his entire career on a foundation of lies. According to her narrative, Marcus had falsified his heroic actions in Iraq to advance his military career, receiving promotions and honors that should have gone to truly deserving soldiers. The Medal of Honor, she argued, was the crown jewel of his deception, a stolen honor that mocked the sacrifice of genuine heroes. The evidence Stevens presented seemed overwhelming at first glance. She had satellite footage that appeared to show Marcus's position during the convoy attack, radio transcripts that contradicted his official report, and witness testimony that painted him as a coward who had abandoned his men when they needed him most. Most damaging of all was the testimony of Sergeant William Foster, whose sworn statement claimed that Marcus had been nowhere near the fighting and had only appeared after the danger had passed to claim credit for someone else's heroic actions. Stevens methodically dismantled Marcus's version of events, pointing out inconsistencies in his story that she claimed proved his deception. She questioned how one man could have single-handedly rescued 12 soldiers from a burning convoy while under heavy enemy fire, suggesting that such heroics were the stuff of Hollywood movies rather than military reality. Her presentation was clinical and devastating, delivered with the precision of someone who had spent months anticipating every possible angle of defense. Major Harrison's opening statement was passionate but hindered by his inability to access the classified information that might have supported Marcus's case. He spoke of a decorated soldier's lifetime of service, of countless acts of courage that had never been questioned until now. Harrison pointed out the suspicious timing of the accusations, the convenient disappearance of key evidence, and the fact that many of the soldiers Marcus had supposedly abandoned were either dead or unwilling to testify. He urged the court to look beyond the carefully constructed narrative being presented by the prosecution and consider the character of the man being accused. The first week of testimony focused on the technical evidence against Marcus. Military analysts explained satellite imagery and radio intercepts, presenting a timeline that seemed to contradict Marcus's account of his actions that day in Iraq. The prosecution's case appeared methodical and thorough, with each piece of evidence building upon the last to create a picture of deliberate deception. Harrison struggled to counter the technical testimony without access to the original source materials, many of which remained classified at levels beyond his clearance. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in London, Sergeant James Mitchell of the Queen's Guard was struggling with a decision that would change everything. Mitchell had been monitoring news coverage of the trial with growing anxiety, knowing that he possessed information that could completely exonerate Marcus Thompson. As a former member of British Special Forces who had participated in joint operations with American units during the Gulf War, Mitchell had been present during Operation Desert Shield, though his involvement remained classified under the Official Secrets Act. Mitchell remembered that day in the Iraqi desert with crystal clarity. He had been part of a covert British unit that was observing American convoy movements when the ambush occurred. Through his scope, he had watched Marcus Thompson display courage that bordered on the superhuman, repeatedly running into enemy fire to pull his wounded soldiers from the burning vehicles. Mitchell and his team had provided cover fire from their concealed position, helping to create the opportunity for Marcus's rescue mission to succeed. The official records had been altered as part of a joint US-UK agreement to hide the presence of British forces in that sector of Iraq. Political sensitivities surrounding international cooperation in the Gulf War had led to the systematic classification and alteration of documents that might reveal unauthorized cross-border operations. Marcus Thompson's Medal of Honor citation had been deliberately vague to avoid mentioning the British involvement, but now that very vagueness was being used to question the authenticity of his heroic actions. Mitchell had tried to contact American military authorities through proper channels, but his efforts had been blocked by officials who insisted that revealing classified information would damage international relations and violate sacred oaths of secrecy. The British military hierarchy was particularly resistant to any disclosure that might embarrass their American allies or reveal the extent of unauthorized operations during the Gulf War. Mitchell found himself caught between his oath of secrecy and his moral obligation to save an innocent man's reputation. Back at Fort Bragg, the prosecution continued to present what appeared to be an insurmountable case against Marcus. Sergeant Foster's video testimony was particularly damaging, delivered with the apparent sincerity of a man who had no reason to lie. Foster described in detail how he and other soldiers had rescued their trapped comrades while Marcus remained safely distant from the fighting. His account was specific and believable, filled with the kind of details that only someone who had been present could have known. What the courtroom didn't know was that Foster's testimony was based on a carefully constructed false narrative that he had been fed by his mysterious contacts. The men who had approached him months earlier had provided him with detailed information about the convoy attack, including radio transcripts, tactical reports, and eyewitness accounts from other soldiers. Foster had been told that this information came from classified debriefings that proved Marcus's deception, and his job was simply to confirm what military intelligence already knew to be true. The psychological pressure on Foster had been enormous. The men who contacted him had implied that Marcus was involved in activities that could damage national security if they became public knowledge. They painted Foster as a patriot who was helping to protect military secrets while ensuring that a fraudulent hero was exposed for what he really was. Foster had served his country faithfully for 8 years and had no reason to doubt the word of men who presented themselves as former intelligence officers with access to information he couldn't see. During the second week of the trial, the prosecution called Dr. Linda Rodriguez, a military psychologist who testified about the psychological profile of soldiers who falsify heroic actions. According to her analysis, Marcus displayed classic characteristics of someone who might fabricate stories to compensate for feelings of inadequacy or cowardice. Her testimony was professional and seemingly objective, but it painted Marcus as a man psychologically capable of living an elaborate lie for nearly 3 decades. Major Harrison's cross-examination of Dr. Rodriguez revealed the speculative nature of her testimony, but the damage had already been done. The prosecution had successfully planted the idea that Marcus Thompson was not just a liar but a psychologically disturbed individual who had constructed an elaborate fantasy to hide his own cowardice. The media coverage following her testimony was devastating, with headlines questioning not just Marcus's military record but his mental stability as well. Sarah Thompson watched her husband grow more withdrawn with each day of the trial. The man who had always been her rock, who had faced every challenge with quiet confidence, was being systematically destroyed by a legal process that seemed designed to favor accusations over truth. She saw him struggling to maintain his military bearing while his entire life's work was being dismissed as an elaborate fiction. The worst part was watching him begin to doubt himself, to wonder if somehow the official records could be right and his memories wrong. The prosecution's case reached its climax with the testimony of Colonel Robert Hayes, a retired intelligence officer who claimed to have knowledge of Marcus's actual activities during Operation Desert Shield. Hayes testified that Marcus had been assigned to a supply convoy that was nowhere near the fighting, and that his medal citation was based on falsified reports submitted after the fact. According to Hayes, Marcus had taken advantage of the chaos following the attack to insert himself into the narrative as a hero. Hayes's testimony was particularly damaging because of his credentials and apparent lack of bias. He presented himself as a reluctant witness who was only coming forward because he could no longer stand to see genuine heroes dishonored by Marcus's continued deception. His account was detailed and specific, corroborated by what appeared to be authentic military documents that supported the prosecution's timeline of events. The defense had no way to challenge his testimony without access to classified materials that might contradict his claims. What the courtroom didn't know was that Hayes was part of the same intelligence network that had orchestrated the cover-up of Operation Desert Shield 3 decades earlier. His testimony was designed to protect classified operations that could still cause political embarrassment if they became public knowledge. Hayes had no personal animosity toward Marcus Thompson, but he had been ordered to ensure that certain aspects of Gulf War operations remained buried, even if it meant destroying an innocent man's reputation in the process. As the prosecution rested its case, the weight of evidence against Marcus seemed overwhelming. The media coverage was uniformly negative, with military analysts questioning how such an obvious fraud could have gone undetected for so long. Public opinion began to turn against Marcus, with many people expressing outrage that tax dollars had been wasted on someone who had stolen honor from genuine war heroes. The case had become a symbol of everything wrong with military culture and the need for greater oversight of military awards. Major Harrison knew that his defense was in trouble. Without access to classified materials or the ability to call key witnesses, he was fighting with severe disadvantages that made victory seem impossible. His client was clearly innocent, but proving that innocence in a court of law was an entirely different matter. Harrison had tried every legal avenue available to him, filing motions for access to classified documents and requesting clearance to interview witnesses who might support Marcus's version of events, but all of his requests had been denied. The defense portion of the trial began with character witnesses who testified about Marcus's integrity and courage throughout his military career. Fellow officers, enlisted personnel who had served under his command, and civilian contractors who had worked with him all painted a picture of a man who was incapable of the deception he was accused of. Their testimony was heartfelt and sincere, but it felt like whispers against the thunderous accusation of systematic fraud that the prosecution had presented. Marcus himself was scheduled to testify the following week, and Harrison knew that his client's performance on the witness stand would likely determine the outcome of the trial. Marcus had remained stoic throughout the proceedings, but Harrison could see the toll that months of character assassination had taken on him. The confident leader who had commanded respect throughout his military career was beginning to crack under the pressure of defending actions that had occurred nearly 30 years ago. As the second week of trial concluded, Judge Colonel Thornfield adjourned the proceedings until Monday morning. Marcus left the courtroom that Friday afternoon knowing that his fate rested in the hands of 12 military officers who had heard damning testimony about his character and conduct. The man who had once been celebrated as a genuine American hero was now facing the very real possibility of spending his remaining years in federal prison as a convicted fraud. That weekend, while Marcus prepared for what might be the most important testimony of his life, Sergeant James Mitchell made a decision that would change everything. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace in his distinctive red tunic and bearskin hat, Mitchell decided that his oath to protect classified information did not extend to allowing an innocent man to be destroyed by lies and cover-ups. He began making phone calls to contacts in British intelligence, setting in motion a chain of events that would expose the truth about Operation Desert Shield and vindicate Marcus Thompson in ways that no one could have imagined. Monday morning arrived with a biting wind that seemed to cut through the walls of the courthouse at Fort Bragg. Marcus Thompson had barely slept over the weekend, spending hours in his study going over the events of that day in Iraq, preparing to defend his actions to a room full of strangers who would decide whether he was a hero or a criminal. Sarah had found him at 4 a.m, sitting at his desk with old photographs spread before him, pictures of the soldiers he had served with, many of whom were now dead and could never testify on his behalf. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity as Marcus took the witness stand. Every seat was filled with reporters, military personnel, and members of the public who had followed the case with intense interest. The weight of their collective gaze felt heavier than any burden Marcus had carried during his decades of military service. Major Harrison had coached him extensively on what to expect during his testimony, but nothing could really prepare a man for having his entire life's work scrutinized and questioned by hostile attorneys determined to prove him a liar. Judge Colonel Thornfield called the court to order with her characteristic authority, her steel-gray eyes surveying the crowded room with the vigilance of someone who tolerated no disruptions to the dignity of military justice. She had presided over hundreds of courts-martial during her career, but few had generated the level of public interest and media attention that surrounded the Marcus Thompson case. The outcome would undoubtedly influence how the military handled questions of heroism and fraud for years to come. Major Harrison began his direct examination of Marcus with carefully crafted questions designed to establish his character and credibility. Marcus spoke in clear, measured tones about his military career, his dedication to the soldiers under his command, and his unwavering commitment to the values of honor, courage, and country that had guided every decision he had made. His voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who had faced life-and-death situations with steady nerves, though careful observers could detect the slight tremor that revealed the emotional toll of the proceedings. When Harrison guided Marcus through the events of that day in Iraq, the courtroom fell silent with an intensity that was almost palpable. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, transporting himself back to that desert valley where everything had changed in a matter of minutes. He described the sound of the first explosions, the sight of the overturned vehicles engulfed in flames, and the screams of his trapped soldiers echoing across the barren landscape. His recollection was vivid and specific, filled with the kind of sensory details that only someone who had actually been there could provide. Marcus testified about his decision to abandon the relative safety of his command position and run into the kill zone where his men were trapped. He explained his thought process in those crucial moments, how training and instinct had taken over when conscious decision-making became impossible. There had been no time for heroic speeches or dramatic gestures, just the simple calculation that his soldiers were going to die unless someone acted immediately. The fact that he was the commanding officer made the decision automatic. The safety of his men was his responsibility, and failure was not an option he was willing to accept. The cross-examination by Colonel Stevens was brutal and relentless. She attacked every aspect of Marcus's testimony with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a prosecutor who had built her career on exposing fraudulent military claims. Stevens questioned how one man could have accomplished what Marcus claimed to have done, suggesting that his story was physically impossible and logically inconsistent with the evidence she had presented. Her tone was skeptical and accusatory, designed to make Marcus appear defensive and unreliable. Stevens confronted Marcus with the satellite imagery that supposedly showed his position during the attack, demanding that he explain how he could have been in two places at once. She questioned the timing of his actions, the lack of corroborating witnesses, and the convenient destruction of evidence that might have supported his version of events. Her questions were rapid-fire and aggressive, intended to confuse and fluster a witness who might inadvertently reveal inconsistencies in his story under pressure. Marcus maintained his composure throughout the grueling cross-examination, answering each question with the same steady confidence that had characterized his military leadership. When Stevens suggested that he had fabricated his heroic actions to cover up his own cowardice, Marcus looked directly at her and stated with quiet dignity that he had never abandoned a soldier under his command and never would. His sincerity was evident to everyone in the courtroom, though whether it would be enough to overcome the weight of evidence against him remained an open question. The most difficult moment came when Stevens forced Marcus to confront the testimony of Sergeant Foster, who had claimed that Marcus was nowhere near the fighting during the convoy attack. Marcus struggled to explain how a fellow soldier could make such accusations, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke about the bond between men who had served together in combat. He could offer no explanation for Foster's testimony except to say that the man was either mistaken or lying, and he had no idea why either would be the case. During a brief recess, Sarah approached her husband with tears in her eyes, reaching out to squeeze his hand in a gesture of support that spoke louder than any words could have. Marcus forced a smile for her benefit, but both of them could feel the weight of the prosecution's case pressing down on them like a physical force. The evidence against Marcus seemed so comprehensive and convincing that even his own defense team was beginning to show signs of doubt about their chances for acquittal. Major Harrison recalled Marcus to the stand for redirect examination, attempting to rehabilitate his client's credibility and address some of the most damaging aspects of the prosecution's attack. He had Marcus walk through his story once more, this time with even greater attention to detail, hoping that the specificity and emotional authenticity of his account would resonate with the military jury. Harrison also addressed the question of why Marcus's version of events differed from the official record, allowing his client to explain that military reports were often sanitized for security reasons and didn't always capture the full reality of combat situations. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, Sergeant James Mitchell was experiencing the most challenging day of his military career. Standing at attention outside Buckingham Palace in his crimson tunic and towering bearskin hat, Mitchell was going through the motions of his ceremonial duties while his mind raced through the implications of the decision he had made over the weekend. He had violated every protocol of military secrecy by reaching out to former colleagues in British intelligence, but he could no longer stand by and watch an innocent man be destroyed by lies and cover-ups. The phone calls Mitchell had made over the weekend had set off alarm bells throughout the British intelligence community. His former commanding officer, Colonel Sir Edward Pemberton, had been awakened at his countryside estate by a secure phone call informing him that one of his former soldiers was threatening to expose classified operations from the Gulf War. Pemberton, now retired but still connected to the highest levels of British government, understood immediately that Mitchell's revelations could cause serious diplomatic problems between the United Kingdom and the United States. The truth about Operation Desert Shield was more complex and politically sensitive than anyone involved in the court-martial realized. The convoy attack that had made Marcus Thompson a hero had actually been part of a joint U.S.-British intelligence operation designed to intercept Iraqi communications equipment. British special forces had been operating illegally in that sector of Iraq, conducting surveillance missions that violated international agreements about operational boundaries during the Gulf War. Marcus Thompson's heroic rescue of his soldiers had inadvertently exposed the British presence in the area, forcing intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic to engage in an elaborate cover-up to protect ongoing operations and prevent diplomatic embarrassment. The official records had been altered to remove any reference to British involvement, creating the inconsistencies and gaps that were now being used to question Marcus's credibility. The hero had become a liability, not because he had done anything wrong, but because his actions had threatened to expose secrets that powerful people needed to keep buried. Colonel Pemberton spent Monday morning making urgent phone calls to contacts in the American intelligence community, trying to gauge how much damage Mitchell's potential revelations might cause. What he discovered alarmed him even more than the original security breach. The Americans were not just covering up British involvement in the operation, they were actively destroying Marcus Thompson to prevent him from ever having a platform to reveal what he had witnessed that day in the desert. The realization that an innocent man was being sacrificed to protect bureaucratic secrets filled Pemberton with a disgust that overcame his natural instinct for secrecy and self-preservation. He had spent 40 years in military intelligence, managing secrets that could topple governments and start wars, but he had never been involved in something as morally bankrupt as the systematic destruction of a war hero's reputation. The code of honor that had guided his entire career demanded that he take action, regardless of the personal and professional consequences. Back at Fort Bragg, the defense portion of the trial was winding down with a series of character witnesses who testified about Marcus's integrity and courage throughout his military career. General Robert Martinez, who had commanded Marcus during several deployments, spoke eloquently about his subordinates' dedication to duty and the soldiers under his command. Colonel Sarah Davidson, who had worked with Marcus on joint operations, testified about his tactical brilliance and his willingness to risk his own safety for the welfare of others. The character witnesses painted a picture of a soldier who had consistently demonstrated the highest levels of professional competence and personal integrity throughout a distinguished career. Their testimony was moving and sincere, but it felt like a whisper against the hurricane of evidence that the prosecution had assembled. The jury members listened respectfully to each witness, but their faces revealed nothing about whether they found the testimony compelling or merely sentimental appeals for leniency. Dr. Michael Roberts, a military historian who had studied Medal of Honor recipients, testified about the heroic actions that Marcus was accused of fabricating. According to his research, similar acts of individual courage had been documented throughout military history, and Marcus's claimed actions were entirely consistent with authenticated cases of exceptional heroism under fire. Roberts argued that the prosecution's suggestion that one man could not have accomplished what Marcus claimed to have done was contradicted by numerous historical examples of individual soldiers performing seemingly impossible feats in combat situations. The final defense witness was Chaplain William Murphy, who had counseled Marcus during his recovery from injuries sustained during the convoy rescue. Murphy testified that Marcus had never spoken of his actions with pride or self-aggrandizement, but rather with the quiet humility of a man who had done what was necessary without regard for personal recognition. According to the chaplain, Marcus had been more concerned about the welfare of his wounded soldiers than about any medals or commendations he might receive for his actions. As the defense rested its case, Major Harrison felt the crushing weight of inadequacy that comes with knowing you have not done enough to save your client. Despite his best efforts, he had been unable to overcome the fundamental disadvantage of fighting against classified evidence and witnesses he could not call. The prosecution's case had been carefully constructed to appear overwhelming, and Harrison feared that his emotional appeals and character witnesses were insufficient to overcome the apparent weight of technical evidence against Marcus. Judge Colonel Thornfield announced that closing arguments would begin the following morning, giving both sides the night to prepare their final appeals to the jury. The courtroom slowly emptied as spectators filed out into the cold North Carolina evening, many of them convinced that they had just witnessed the final chapter in the fall of a once great military hero. The media coverage that night was uniformly pessimistic about Marcus's chances, with legal experts predicting a swift conviction and significant prison sentence. Marcus spent that evening at home with Sarah, sitting quietly in their living room and trying to come to terms with the possibility that he might spend his remaining years in federal prison. They spoke little, both of them knowing that words were inadequate to express the emotions they were experiencing. The Medal of Honor sat in its case on Marcus's desk, a tangible reminder of the honor that was about to be stripped away from him forever. What Marcus didn't know was that his salvation was already in motion, set off by a British royal guard who had decided that some truths were more important than the oaths of secrecy that bound him to silence. Colonel Sir Edward Pemberton was working through the night, making phone calls and pulling strings that had not been used in decades, determined to prevent an innocent man from being destroyed by the machinery of government cover-ups. The truth about Operation Desert Shield was about to be revealed, but it would come at a price that no one could have anticipated. The next morning would bring closing arguments and jury deliberation, but it would also bring revelations that would shock everyone involved in the trial and expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of military command on both sides of the Atlantic. Marcus Thompson's greatest battle was about to be won by allies he didn't even know he had, fighting a war for truth and justice that had been decades in the making. The dawn of Tuesday morning brought an unexpected phone call to Major David Harrison's hotel room at Fort Bragg. The voice on the other end identified itself as Colonel Sir Edward Pemberton of Her Majesty's Intelligence Service, calling from London with information that could dramatically alter the outcome of Marcus Thompson's court-martial. Harrison, groggy from another sleepless night preparing his closing argument, initially thought the call was some sort of elaborate prank, but the caller's knowledge of classified details from the trial convinced him otherwise. Pemberton explained that he had information that could exonerate Marcus Thompson completely, but revealing it would require violating decades of international intelligence agreements and potentially causing a diplomatic crisis between the United Kingdom and the United States. He had spent the previous night in consultation with the highest levels of British government, ultimately receiving reluctant permission to share classified information that had been buried for nearly 30 years. The decision had not been made lightly, but the alternative, allowing an innocent man to be imprisoned for crimes he did not commit, was morally unacceptable to everyone involved. Within hours of Pemberton's call, a series of extraordinary events began unfolding that would transform the trial from a routine military court-martial into an international incident with implications far beyond one soldier's reputation. British intelligence operatives were dispatched to Washington with classified documents that had never been intended for American eyes, while diplomatic channels buzzed with urgent communications between London and the Pentagon about damage control and information management. At Buckingham Palace, Sergeant James Mitchell was relieved of his ceremonial duties and escorted to a secure briefing room where he was debriefed by intelligence officers who had flown in from various classified locations around the world. Mitchell's decision to break his oath of secrecy had triggered a chain reaction that was forcing both governments to confront uncomfortable truths about their cooperation during the Gulf War and the lengths they had gone to in order to protect those secrets. The scene at Fort Bragg was one of controlled chaos as word spread that the trial was about to take an unprecedented turn. Judge Colonel Thornfield received a secure communication from the Pentagon ordering her to postpone closing arguments while new evidence was being evaluated for national security implications. The media, sensing that something extraordinary was happening, descended on the courthouse in even greater numbers, though none of them could have imagined the scope of the revelations that were about to unfold. Colonel Stevens was furious at the unexpected delay, correctly suspecting that someone was attempting to manipulate the trial's outcome through last-minute political interference. She had spent months building what she believed was an unshakable case against Marcus Thompson, and the possibility that her victory might be snatched away by classified information she couldn't access or challenge filled her with professional rage. Stevens demanded answers from her superiors, but found herself facing the same stone wall of secrecy that had protected Operation Desert Shield for 3 decades. Marcus Thompson sat in the courthouse conference room with Major Harrison, trying to process the sudden turn of events that might represent his salvation or simply another cruel twist in a case that had already defied all expectations. Harrison was frantically trying to understand the legal implications of international intelligence involvement in a military court-martial, consulting with experts who had never encountered such a situation before. The possibility that Marcus might be exonerated was almost too overwhelming to contemplate after months of seemingly inevitable doom. The breakthrough came when a British diplomatic courier arrived at Fort Bragg with a leather briefcase containing documents that would revolutionize everyone's understanding of Operation Desert Shield. The files included satellite photos, radio intercepts, and after-action reports that had never been shared with American authorities, all of them providing irrefutable proof that Marcus Thompson had acted exactly as he claimed. More importantly, they revealed the presence of British special forces during the convoy attack, explaining the inconsistencies in the official record that had been used to question Marcus's credibility. Sergeant James Mitchell was flown from London to Fort Bragg under military escort, carrying with him the burden of testimony that could save an innocent man while potentially ending his own military career. The flight across the Atlantic gave him time to reflect on the decision that had brought him to this moment, and he remained convinced that revealing the truth was worth any personal consequences he might face. Mitchell had spent his entire adult life serving his country with honor, and he refused to let that service be tainted by allowing an injustice to continue. The classified briefing that took place in Judge Colonel Thornfield's chambers involved representatives from the highest levels of both American and British intelligence agencies. Pemberton presented evidence that completely contradicted the prosecution's version of events, including testimony from Mitchell and other British soldiers who had witnessed Marcus's heroic actions firsthand. The scope of the cover-up was breathtaking, involving altered documents, fabricated evidence, and the systematic intimidation of potential witnesses who might have supported Marcus's version of events. The most shocking revelation was that Sergeant William Foster's damaging testimony had been orchestrated by intelligence operatives who had fed him false information and threatened him with consequences if he didn't cooperate. Foster had genuinely believed that he was helping to expose a fraudulent hero, when in reality he was being manipulated to destroy an innocent man whose only crime had been witnessing classified British operations in Iraq. The web of deception was so complex and far-reaching that it would take months to unravel all of its implications. Judge Colonel Thornfield found herself facing a situation that had no precedent in military law. The evidence of Marcus Thompson's innocence was overwhelming, but revealing it publicly would expose intelligence operations that both governments insisted must remain classified. The legal, political, and diplomatic implications of the case had grown far beyond anything a single military court could handle, yet she had an obligation to ensure that justice was served regardless of the political consequences. The decision was made to reconvene the court in closed session, with only essential personnel present and all media excluded from the proceedings. The jury was sworn to additional secrecy oaths that carried severe criminal penalties for any disclosure of classified information they might hear during the remainder of the trial. What followed was the most extraordinary reversal in the history of military justice, as the prosecution's carefully constructed case was systematically demolished by evidence that had been hidden for 3 decades. Sergeant Mitchell took the witness stand in the closed courtroom and delivered testimony that was devastating to the prosecution's case. Speaking in the crisp, precise language of a professional soldier, Mitchell described watching Marcus Thompson repeatedly risk his life to save his trapped soldiers while British Special Forces provided covering fire from concealed positions. His account was corroborated by classified photographs and radio transcripts that had never been seen by American authorities, providing irrefutable proof that Marcus had acted exactly as he claimed. The revelation that British forces had been operating in the area explained every inconsistency in the official record that had been used to question Marcus's credibility. The satellite photos that supposedly showed his position during the attack had been deliberately misinterpreted, and the radio transcripts had been edited to remove references to British involvement. The prosecution's case, which had seemed so solid just days earlier, was revealed to be built entirely on fabricated evidence and deliberately falsified testimony. Colonel Stevens found herself in the impossible position of having to acknowledge that her entire case had been based on lies and cover-ups that she had no knowledge of or involvement in creating. The evidence she had presented with such confidence was revealed to be part of an elaborate deception designed to protect intelligence operations rather than expose military fraud. Her reputation as an uncompromising prosecutor was destroyed in a matter of hours, though she had been as much a victim of the conspiracy as Marcus Thompson himself. The classified testimony continued for 2 days, during which a parade of British intelligence officers and Special Forces soldiers corroborated Mitchell's account of the convoy attack. Each witness provided additional details that supported Marcus's version of events while exposing the scope of the international cover-up that had nearly destroyed his life. The jury listened in stunned silence as the full magnitude of the deception was revealed, understanding that they were witnessing the exposure of one of the most elaborate military conspiracies in modern history. The most emotional moment came when Colonel Pemberton himself took the stand to explain why the truth had been hidden for so long. Speaking with the authority of someone who had spent 4 decades in military intelligence, Pemberton acknowledged that the decision to alter the official records had been made for national security reasons that seemed compelling at the time. However, he stated with obvious regret, no security concern could justify allowing an innocent man to be destroyed by lies and fabricated evidence. Major Harrison's redirect examination of Marcus was brief but powerful. With the truth finally revealed, Marcus was able to explain the inconsistencies in his story that had seemed so damaging during the original trial. Every question that had been raised about his actions was answered by the classified evidence, and his account was validated by witnesses who had no reason to lie on his behalf. The man who had entered the courtroom as an accused fraud was revealed to be exactly what he had always claimed to be, a genuine American hero. The prosecution's case collapsed completely under the weight of the new evidence. Colonel Stevens made a brief statement acknowledging that the government could no longer maintain the charges against Marcus Thompson in light of the classified information that had been revealed. She offered no apology for the months of character assassination that Marcus had endured, but her obvious humiliation was visible to everyone present in the courtroom. The jury deliberation lasted less than an hour, during which time the 12 military officers struggled to process the extraordinary revelations they had witnessed. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreman announced their unanimous verdict of not guilty on all charges, accompanied by a rare statement expressing their regret that Marcus had been forced to endure such an ordeal. The relief in the room was palpable, though tempered by the realization that the broader implications of the case were far from resolved. Judge Colonel Thornfield dismissed all charges against Marcus Thompson and ordered that his Medal of Honor be immediately restored to him with full honors. She also announced that there would be a full investigation into how such a massive miscarriage of justice had been allowed to occur, though she acknowledged that many aspects of the case would likely remain classified for national security reasons. Her final words to Marcus were a simple statement that justice had finally been served, even if it had taken far too long to arrive. The scene outside the courthouse was surreal as word of Marcus's complete exoneration spread through the media. Reporters who had spent months portraying him as a fraudulent hero suddenly found themselves scrambling to understand how they had gotten the story so wrong. The implications of the case extended far beyond one soldier's reputation, raising fundamental questions about government accountability and the lengths to which intelligence agencies would go to protect their secrets. Marcus Thompson emerged from the courthouse a free and vindicated man, but the cost of his ordeal was evident in his appearance and demeanor. Months of character assassination and legal warfare had taken a toll that would require time and support to overcome. The Medal of Honor was restored to its place on his chest, but the experience of having his entire life's work questioned and dismissed would remain with him forever. Sarah Thompson's relief was overwhelming as she embraced her husband on the courthouse steps, knowing that the nightmare was finally over but also understanding that the healing process would be long and difficult. The media attention that had been so destructive during the trial would continue, though now it would focus on the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed an innocent man rather than on accusations of fraud and cowardice. That evening, Sergeant James Mitchell returned to London knowing that his military career was effectively over but feeling no regret about the decision he had made. The courage he had shown in speaking truth to power was different from the physical bravery required on a battlefield, but it was no less important or valuable. His actions had saved an innocent man from imprisonment and exposed a conspiracy that had infected the highest levels of military command on both sides of the Atlantic. The reverberations from the Marcus Thompson case would continue for months as investigations were launched and diplomatic relations were strained by the revelations of the extensive cover-up. But, on this particular evening, justice had been served, truth had prevailed over deception, and a genuine American hero had been restored to his rightful place in history. The weeks following Marcus Thompson's exoneration were a whirlwind of media attention, official investigations, and personal reckoning that would reshape not only his life but the entire landscape of military accountability. The man who had entered the courthouse as an accused fraud had emerged as the central figure in one of the most significant military justice scandals in American history. The Medal of Honor gleamed once again on his chest, but its restoration came with the heavy knowledge of how easily truth could be buried and how devastating the consequences could be for those caught in the machinery of government cover-ups. The immediate aftermath of the trial saw a complete reversal in media coverage as journalists who had spent months portraying Marcus as a fraudulent hero suddenly found themselves investigating the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed him. The story of the British Royal Guard who had risked everything to expose the truth captured public imagination and became a symbol of individual courage standing against institutional corruption. International media coverage painted the case as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked government secrecy and the importance of protecting whistleblowers who choose conscience over convenience. Colonel Patricia Stevens faced immediate consequences for her role in the prosecution, though the extent of her knowledge about the fabricated evidence remained unclear. An internal investigation revealed that she had been provided with altered documents and coached witnesses without her knowledge, making her as much a victim of the conspiracy as Marcus himself. However, her aggressive prosecution tactics and failure to question obvious inconsistencies in the evidence led to her reassignment to a desk job with little prospect of advancement. The case became a defining moment in her career, transforming her from a rising star in military law enforcement into a cautionary example of what could happen when prosecutors became too focused on winning rather than seeking truth. Sergeant William Foster experienced perhaps the most traumatic reversal of anyone involved in the case. The man who had been convinced he was helping to expose a fraudulent hero discovered that he had been manipulated into nearly destroying an innocent man's life. The revelation that his testimony was based entirely on false information provided by intelligence operatives sent him into a spiral of guilt and self-recrimination that required extensive psychological counseling. Foster eventually reached out to Marcus personally to apologize for his role in the conspiracy, leading to a painful but necessary conversation between two soldiers who had both been victimized by the same corrupt system. The investigation into the conspiracy that had targeted Marcus revealed a web of deception that stretched across multiple government agencies and spanned 3 decades. Congressional hearings were convened to examine how such an elaborate cover-up could have been maintained for so long and what other innocent individuals might have been victimized by similar operations. The testimony of intelligence officials who had participated in the conspiracy was often contradictory and evasive, hampered by classification restrictions that made full disclosure impossible even in closed-session hearings. Sergeant James Mitchell became an unlikely hero in both Britain and America, receiving widespread praise for his courage in speaking truth to power despite the personal and professional risks involved. However, his violation of the Official Secrets Act led to his discharge from the British Army and the loss of his pension rights, consequences that he accepted with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his decision to come forward. A private fundraising campaign organized by veterans groups on both sides of the Atlantic raised enough money to compensate him for his financial losses, while job offers poured in from private security companies and military contractors who valued his integrity and courage. The diplomatic implications of the case strained relations between the United States and Britain as both governments struggled to manage the fallout from revelations about unauthorized intelligence operations during the Gulf War. High-level meetings were held to discuss how much additional information should be declassified and how to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. The British government eventually issued a formal apology to Marcus Thompson for their role in the cover-up, while the American military leadership promised comprehensive reforms to prevent the abuse of classification powers to hide criminal activity. Marcus himself struggled with the transition from accused criminal to vindicated hero, finding it difficult to process the complete reversal of his circumstances and the knowledge that so many people had been willing to destroy his reputation to protect abstract concepts of national security. The months of character assassination had left deep psychological wounds that would take time and professional help to heal. Sarah noticed that her husband was different after the trial, more cautious in his interactions with others and less trusting of the military institution that had defined his entire adult life. The restoration ceremony for Marcus's Medal of Honor took place at the Pentagon with full military honors, attended by the Secretary of Defense and other high-ranking officials who wanted to demonstrate the military's commitment to justice and accountability. The ceremony was broadcast live on national television, providing a platform for Marcus to address the American people directly about his ordeal and the importance of protecting truth-tellers who risk everything to expose corruption. His speech was measured and dignified, focusing more on the institutional reforms needed to prevent similar injustices than on his personal suffering. The legal consequences for those involved in the conspiracy were limited by the classification restrictions that made full prosecution impossible. Several intelligence officers were quietly forced to retire or resign, while others faced administrative discipline that would effectively end their careers. The culture of secrecy that had enabled the conspiracy made it difficult to hold individuals accountable, leading to widespread frustration among those who wanted to see more dramatic consequences for the abuse of power that had nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. Major David Harrison emerged from the case as one of the most sought-after military defense attorneys in the country, his successful representation of Marcus Thompson despite overwhelming odds establishing his reputation as someone who could handle the most challenging cases. The experience taught him valuable lessons about the importance of persistence and the dangers of accepting official narratives without question. He remained in contact with Marcus and became an advocate for military justice reform, using his platform to push for greater transparency and accountability in military legal proceedings. The congressional investigation into the conspiracy ultimately led to significant reforms in how classified information could be used in military prosecutions and new protections for whistleblowers who exposed government wrongdoing. The Marcus Thompson Protection Act, as it came to be known, established strict oversight procedures for any prosecution involving classified evidence and created an independent review board to investigate claims of prosecutorial misconduct in military cases. The reforms were named in Marcus's honor despite his protests that he wanted no credit for changes that should have existed all along. Judge Colonel Margaret Thornfield retired from active duty shortly after the case concluded, citing her frustration with a system that had allowed such an elaborate miscarriage of justice to occur. In her final interview before leaving the military, she expressed regret that it had taken outside intervention to reveal the truth and called for fundamental changes in how the military justice system handled cases involving classified information. Her parting words were a warning that the Marcus Thompson case was probably not unique and that other innocent individuals might be suffering similar injustices that had not yet been exposed. The international implications of the case led to new agreements between allied nations about information sharing and the protection of individuals who might be harmed by intelligence operations. The revelation that British forces had been operating illegally in Iraq forced a re-examination of other Gulf War operations and led to the declassification of documents that revealed the extent of unauthorized international cooperation during the conflict. The transparency that resulted from the case was limited, but it represented a significant step forward in government accountability. Marcus and Sarah Thompson eventually moved to a small town in Montana where they could live quietly away from the media attention that continued to follow the case. Marcus took a job teaching military history at a local college, finding satisfaction in educating young people about the realities of military service and the importance of maintaining ethical standards even under the most challenging circumstances. He rarely spoke publicly about his ordeal, preferring to let his actions and the reforms that resulted from the case speak for themselves. The relationship between Marcus and James Mitchell evolved into a deep friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience of standing up for principle despite enormous personal costs. They corresponded regularly and eventually met in person when Mitchell visited the United States for a veterans conference. The British ex-soldier had found work as a security consultant and was building a new life free from the constraints of military secrecy, though he continued to advocate for greater protection of whistleblowers in both Britain and America. The psychological healing process for Marcus was slow and difficult, requiring extensive counseling to overcome the trauma of having his entire life's work questioned and nearly destroyed. The realization that his own government had been willing to sacrifice him to protect bureaucratic secrets was perhaps more devastating than any physical wound he had sustained in combat. However, the support of his family, the vindication provided by the trial's outcome, and his work with other veterans helped him gradually rebuild his sense of purpose and identity. The case became a subject of academic study in military justice courses around the world, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked government power and the importance of protecting individual rights even in matters of national security. Law schools used the case to teach students about the ethical obligations of prosecutors and the responsibility of the legal system to seek truth rather than simply secure convictions. The story of the Royal Guard who risked everything to expose injustice became a powerful example of moral courage for military personnel facing similar ethical dilemmas. 5 years after his exoneration, Marcus Thompson was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in recognition not only of his military service but also of his dignity and grace in the face of an unprecedented assault on his character. The ceremony took place in the Rose Garden with James Mitchell in attendance as a special guest, symbolizing the international cooperation that had ultimately led to justice being served. In his acceptance speech, Marcus dedicated the award to all military personnel who had been victimized by government cover-ups and to those who had the courage to speak truth to power regardless of the personal consequences. The legacy of the Marcus Thompson case continued to influence military justice and government accountability long after the media attention faded. The reforms implemented as a result of the scandal prevented similar abuses and provided new protections for both accused personnel and potential whistleblowers. The story served as a reminder that even the most powerful institutions could be held accountable when individuals had the courage to demand that truth prevail over convenience and that justice was more important than protecting the reputations of those who abused their authority. The Medal of Honor that Marcus wore had been restored to its rightful place, but its meaning had been forever changed by the experience of having it unjustly taken away. It no longer represented just the heroic actions of one day in an Iraqi desert, but the broader principle that courage comes in many forms and that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on foreign battlefields but in courtrooms and congressional hearing rooms where the fate of justice itself hangs in the balance. The judge who had demanded the medal be taken away had learned, along with the rest of the world, that truth has a way of emerging even from the deepest shadows of government secrecy, and that real heroes are those who are willing to sacrifice everything to ensure that it does.